All right, we're going to start with a little bit of good news. So this just kind of popped up today. He's been sued 3 times, essentially, by a department inside of the state of Colorado. And they've lost every single time, making its way past the Colorado Supreme Court. But the 3rd time, the cake baker, Jack, won in the Colorado State Supreme Court. So his 12-year legal battle is done. And in this particular case, it looks as if all of the right things happened. So, hey, this is good news. This is really good news. So I wanted to make sure we started there because you know what else happens on these nights and the dark places that we go to on Tuesday evenings. So the statute's still on the books. They've lost with that statute 2.5 times now. They will still do lawfare. Yeah. And this is, we'll discuss this a little bit later on. This has now become the entire world of the political left, is censorship and lawfare and fear and lying. We'll talk about that with some of what the rest of what we're going to deal with tonight. But that's a good point. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the brain trust on the left this evening. Some of you may remember Rush Limbaugh's friendly moniker, his favorite term for Senator John Kerry called him Lurch. And so Lurch is still doing his thing. This hit the surface, it was about a week and a half ago at another World Economic Summit meeting. He was on a panel discussion. You can watch the video. He was abundantly clear that one of the things that keeps the World Economic Forum and the global left from doing the things that they know they need to do to make life better for all of the rest of us is the First Amendment. It's in the way, so he was making the argument that we need to win elections so that we can get rid of the First Amendment and finally do some actual good. This is increasingly not just becoming kind of one of these, it feels like a half conspiratorial kind of conversation. You might be able to find some obscure academics who talk about it. This is now this is now clearly in the wide open now. This talk about the First Amendment is in our way. The right to free speech is not absolute, and all of these half-baked arguments are being put forth for it. So it was Senator John Kerry at the World Economic Forum Sustainable Development Impact meetings, and doesn't that sound like good news? Only good things can come from this particular meeting, right? John Kerry, the Biden-Harris administration's former climate czar and former Secretary of State, claimed the First Amendment is not so much about protecting free speech, but about putting disinformation out of existence. If people go to only one source and the source they go to is sick and has an agenda and they're putting out disinformation, he said, our First Amendment stands as a major block to the ability to be able to just hammer it out of existence. So the one source that he's talking about is the one source they know they do not have power over right now, and that is Twitter. It's X. Another platform that is sort of in that orbit that they don't yet have control over is Telegram. And both of these platforms, you find things quicker on these platforms than you find just about anywhere else. So this is a veiled threat to the owners of these platforms. Elon Musk has just simply said, if the right loses the presidential campaign, he fully expects to be put in prison sometime in the next 4 years. They've done this to the man who started and owns Telegram. He landed in France, and France threw him in prison. So this is just what the global left does now. Now, you know you are dealing with a serious journalist when at the end of this article about John Kerry, the last sentence is this: the former U.S. senator was infamously accused of breaking wind, a toxic emission climate change enthusiasts at an environmental conference in Dubai in 2023. This is why they're slaughtering tens of thousands of cattle in Europe, is because of flatulence. And so the reporter just wanted to say he was caught on mic and he's bad for the environment. So you know you're dealing with serious journalism when you get that. So it's not just John Kerry at the World Economic Forum. If you follow the news rather infamously, Tim Walz has said in a couple of different places, in a couple of different ways, including in one particular way in the VP debate, there's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy. This particular article comes from the Hoover Institution, which is a great institution, and they just kind of tear apart the simplistic argument that he gives that there's no guarantee to free speech. A Harris-Walz administration would be a nightmare for free speech, by Jonathan Turley, who's a fascinating author and lawyer. Walz went on MSNBC to support censoring disinformation and declared, there's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy. So if you say anything bad about our government or what we want to do, you should not have the right to free speech. That's what he means by disinformation and misinformation around our democracy. Right now, if people with political power say these kinds of things, who do you think is going to decide what is misinformation and disinformation, right? It's just a very natural step. Ironically, this false claim repeated by many Democrats constitutes one of the most dangerous forms of disinformation. It is being used to convince the free people to give up some of their freedom with a nothing to see here pitch. Nothing bad is going to happen to you if you allow us to control the means of information. At least you won't hear anything false. So this is always a path toward totalitarianism. It just is. This is a knowable path. This is an obvious path. This is one that people have been writing about for 100 years, in some cases over 100 years now, that those who are in control of information in the newspapers and who gets airbrushed out of photos and who gets to talk and who doesn't get to talk, these are our tyrants, right? Yes, sir. Elon Musk often posts on X this little meme that says, make sure Trump doesn't cheat, demand voter ID. So that's his version of kind of turning, make sure he doesn't cheat, so just let's demand voter ID, right? Hannah Arendt, we've discussed her often. In her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she escaped the Nazis. She escaped a lot of the communism and socialism that rose in the West. She was a Jew in Europe, and so she literally escaped a lot of things. A very thoughtful philosopher, political philosopher, and so on and so forth. One of the things she writes in this 700 some odd page long book should resonate with us. Totalitarian propaganda can outrageously insult common sense only where common sense has lost its validity. We end up sort of shaking our heads going, how does this get past most people's mental filters? How does this actually land in some people's laps and make sense? Well, part of what she says is that, well, cultures can get to the point where they're far more susceptible to propaganda because all of these other critical thinking skills have been either worn down or educated out of people or beaten out of people or frightened out of people. So where common sense just doesn't have this role anymore that it should have, then all of these obviously false things will rise to the surface. As I was kind of playing around with this notion of the First Amendment, free speech, freedom of religion, I ran across another character in the Revolutionary War. There are a lot of these characters that are actually incredibly important to the process of the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence, the creation of the Constitution. One of them was a Baptist minister by the name of John Leland. He spent a lot of his time in Virginia, some of it a little bit further north, but he turns out to be a really interesting character. So when and where he was, especially in Virginia, a very popular preacher at the time, he was good friends with both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. So as friends with them, he was engaged with them intellectually, writing back and forth about the formation of the Constitution, all these kinds of things. In the state of Virginia, Leland, along with Jefferson and Madison, was critical to creating the freedom of religion and freedom of conscience clauses in the state constitution in Virginia. Some of you may know that when the Constitution was first written, it did not contain the Bill of Rights. So the First Amendment was originally not inside of the Constitution. So when the Constitution was going from state to state to be ratified by the states, when Virginia was electing their representatives to go sit in their house to ratify the Constitution, John Leland was so popular, a Baptist preacher and minister, he was beating James Madison in this particular race. Now, Madison, for all intents and purposes, is the author of the Constitution. But what Leland did is he said, I will actually back out of the race. You will get this seat to help argue for your Constitution if you include what became the First Amendment. The religious freedom clause, it's a freedom of conscience concept, but religious freedom. So he writes about this, his letters, and he wrote and gave one particular sermon around the ratification of the Constitution. The sermon is called "The Rights of Conscience Inalienable." Now, again, the titles of these sermons, right? You go back, a little over 200 years, and you think, well, I may not know one, maybe possibly two of those words, but it sounds like an awesome title to a sermon. And this whole sermon is in defense of not just religious freedom in a culture, but broad freedom of conscience, which is really interesting coming from a Baptist minister in 1789, writing this sermon and giving this sermon, arguing for this from a biblical Christian point of view. So the notion of religious freedom and freedom of speech is not just a philosophical concept that Jefferson and Madison and others had. It was a theological concept that was incredibly important to the ministers and pastors of the day who were arguing for the Revolution, the Declaration, the Constitution, the First Amendment, and so forth. So here's some of what he had to say from a theological angle in defense of what became the First Amendment. Does a man, upon entering into social compacts, meaning does someone who becomes a part of a culture or society, surrender his conscience to that society to be controlled by the laws thereof, or can he, in justice, assist in making laws to bind his children's consciences before they are born? I judge not, for the following reasons. So you join a society, a body politic. Can you then allow that society to control your conscience? Or can you partake in the creation of laws that will bind the consciences of children not yet born? And he says, as a matter of fact, no, you cannot. It's irrational, it's illogical, and in his view, it's actually unbiblical. So his first reason for this, every man must give an account of himself to God. And therefore, every man ought to be at liberty to serve God in the way that he can best reconcile it to his conscience. So if you stand before God at the end of days, you, therefore, should have the ability to govern your own conscience between you and God. No one else should have the ability to manipulate or control that. If government can answer for individuals at the day of judgment, let men be controlled by it in religious matters. Otherwise, let them be free. So in other words, if your government stands before God at the day of judgment, not you, then they get to do that. But it turns out Joe Biden does not stand in for me at the day of judgment, right? No government official stands in for us at the day of judgment. I do. So he says, therefore, let men be free. Number two, it would be sinful for a man to surrender that to a man which is to be kept sacred for God. A man's mind should be always open to conviction, and an honest man will receive that doctrine which appears the best demonstrated. And what is more common than the best of men to change their minds? It is a sin. He uses theological language to say it is a sin for you to turn your conscience over to a government. It's not just a bad idea. It's not just some bad things might happen, he calls it a sin. So he uses theological language to discuss it. So he says, what is rational and biblical is that your mind should be open in the public square of free ideas to decide what is right and true. In fact, we've determined, he says, that it's a sign of rationality that you might actually change your mind on something. Someone's actually made a better argument. You've decided, you know what? You're right and I'm wrong. I'm going to change my mind. Now, here's part of what's so interesting, I think, about our public discourse right now, that an entire political ideology has completely jettisoned the notion of making a case, of making an argument, of trying to appeal to someone's conscience, their reason. It's all control, canceling, censorship, fines, jails, jail time, threats, on and on and on. A little bit later on in the same sermon, he says this: rulers often fear that if they leave every man to think, speak, and worship as he pleases, that the whole cause will be wrecked in diversity. Everyone's going to go their own way. To prevent which, they establish some standard of orthodoxy to effect uniformity. But is uniformity attainable? This is a magnificent sentence. Millions of men, women, and children have been tortured to death to produce uniformity, and yet the world has not advanced 1 inch towards it. That is a magnificent sentence written before the 20th century, when the Soviets and the Chinese communists and the Laotian communists and the African communists and the French communists and blah, 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 tortured to death millions, hundreds of millions of people to produce uniformity and got none of it. He said, but governments are afraid to allow people to think because they're going to think for themselves. They're not going to conform to government. Government has no more to do with the religious opinions of men than it has with the principles of mathematics. It's got nothing to do with either. Let every man speak freely without fear, maintain the principles that he believes, worship according to his own faith. Now, this next set of phrases is important, because when a lot of people tell you, and some people who are half-informed will say, well, what the original founders of the U.S. Constitution, founding fathers, meant by freedom of religion was, what version of Unitarian or Baptist were you? But all the other religions didn't count. So this is important. Here's a Baptist minister arguing for full and complete freedom of conscience, right? Maintain the principles that he believes. Worship according to his own faith, either one God, 3 gods, no God, or 20 gods. You could be an atheist or a pagan, and let government protect him in so doing. In other words, see that he meets with no personal abuse or loss of property for his religious opinions. So he's making a rational and theological case against the government forcing you to say or believe certain things. Instead of discouraging him with proscriptions, we would call them censorship and cancellation now, fines, confiscation, or death. Let him be encouraged as a free man to bring forth his arguments and maintain his points with all boldness. Then, if his doctrine is false, it will be confuted. And if it is true, though ever so novel or new, let others credit it. When every man has this liberty, what can he wish for more? A liberal man asks for nothing more of government. And this is liberal and what we'd call traditionally liberal. It's anti-dictatorial, fascist, all this kind of stuff. So here's a Baptist pastor giving a sermon on behalf of unlimited freedom of thought and speech. And he's relying on our eventual judgment before God as individuals. And he's relying upon these faculties that God has given us to reason through the difference between truth and falsehood. We should be able to talk about this kind of stuff and then decide who's right and who's wrong. He's relying on these things, which are both deeply biblical concepts. So here we have, again, something that this culture has held dear for a long time that isn't just something given to us by some British and French philosophers that, only those guys used to read, or, Roman Stoics. This is buttressed by theology and very theologically astute and courageous pastors who are saying these things in favor of the culture that you and I have benefited of for over 200 years now. Now, the entire woke worldview is trying to tear apart piece by piece by piece. Is that another hand or a scratch? Scratch, all right. All of a sudden, we've got hands tonight, so I'm on the lookout. Yeah, be careful. Exactly. Sold to the man in the back. So to lead us into our Bible study, this really sad headline came across, just recently. I thought this was sad. FEMA arrests Noah for running unauthorized flood rescue operation. That's a great picture to use for that one, too.